Karen's fist came crashing through the window, shards of glass exploding everywhere. "How dare you!" she screamed, her face red with fury. But as she pulled her hand back, gasping in pain, a sense of dread washed over her. The realization hit. This wasn't just any window. It was a protected historical landmark worth millions. The look of horror on her face said it all. She was in for the fight of her life. David slammed his car door shut, heart pounding. He couldn't believe what had just happened. 1 minute, he was pulling into his driveway, the next, his neighbor Karen was storming over, fists clenched. "You think you can just cut down my trees without my permission?" she yelled, her voice shrill. "What? No. David tried to interject, but Karen cut him off. "Don't play dumb with me. I saw the workers hacking away at my beautiful maple trees this morning. That's private property, you idiot." David held up his hands, panic rising in his chest. "Karen, I swear, I didn't authorize any tree cutting on your land." "That must have been a mistake." "Mistake? My ass." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "You're trying to ruin my property value, aren't you? Well, I won't stand for it." Before David could react, Karen's fist came smashing through the large window of his front door, glass exploding inward. He flinched, shielding his face as shards rained down. "There? How do you like that? Huh?" Karen screamed, cradling her bleeding hand. David stared at her, dumbfounded. "Are you insane? Do you have any idea what you've done?" But Karen's expression quickly shifted from rage to horror as she finally registered the intricate, aged glass of the window frame. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. "Oh my God," she whispered, the color draining from her face. "This is a protected historical landmark." David nodded, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes, Karen, it is, and you just destroyed it." Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't." "It doesn't matter what you knew or didn't know," David interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "You're in big trouble now." Karen's panic escalated as the weight of her actions sank in. She stumbled backwards, cradling her injured hand. No, this can't be happening. I'm going to lose everything." David watched her, a mixture of anger and satisfaction bubbling inside him. After all the times Karen had bullied him, made his life miserable, this was the perfect karma. "You're damn right you are," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "And you have no one to blame but yourself." Karen's eyes darted around, searching for a way out of this nightmare. But she knew there was no escape. She had made a colossal mistake, one that was about to change her life forever. The sound of sirens in the distance sent a jolt of panic through Karen. She whirled around, clutching her bleeding hand. "Oh God, the police. I have to get out of here," she stammered, already backing away. David stepped forward, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going? You're not going anywhere." "You don't understand." Karen's voice rose in desperation. "I can't go to jail, David. I just can't." David shook his head, unmoved by her plea. "You brought this on yourself, Karen. You're going to have to face the consequences." The sirens were growing louder now, closing in fast. Karen's eyes darted around frantically, searching for any possible escape route. But she was trapped, with no way out. "Please, David. Please, you have to help me," she begged, her voice quivering. "I'll do anything, I swear. Just don't let them take me to jail." David studied her, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to see Karen get what she deserved after all the hell she'd put him through over the years. But another part, buried deep down, still felt a twinge of sympathy. "David, please." Karen's desperation reached a fever pitch as the flashing lights of the police cars became visible in the distance. With a heavy sigh, David made his decision. "All right, come on. We need to get you cleaned up before the cops get here. Karen's face flooded with relief as she followed David into the house. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this. Don't thank me yet, David muttered under his breath. You're not out of the woods by a long shot. As he tended to Karen's wounded hand, the sound of the police cars pulling up outside filled the air. David steeled himself, knowing that whatever happened next, his life was about to be turned upside down. But in that moment, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. Karen was finally getting a taste of her own medicine. The front door burst open as two police officers stormed into the house, their faces set in stern expressions. David Alston, one of the officers, barked. David stepped forward, his hands raised. That's me. Officers, I can explain. Save it, the other officer interrupted, his gaze falling on Karen. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Karen's eyes went wide with terror. No, please. I didn't mean to, I swear. She clutched her injured hand, wincing in pain. The officers exchanged a skeptical glance. That's not what the 911 call says, the first officer said, approaching Karen. You're under arrest for destruction of private property. No, 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 Karen shrieked, backing away. You don't understand. This is a historical landmark. I didn't know, I swear. The officers ignored her cries, grabbing her arms and securing her hands behind her back with handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent, the officer recited. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. David watched helplessly as Karen was led away, her anguished screams echoing through the house. Part of him felt a twinge of sympathy, but a larger part was overcome with a sense of vindication. After all the torment she had put him through, it was about time Karen faced the consequences of her actions. As the police cars sped off, sirens blaring, David closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was finally starting to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of dread. This was only the beginning. David knew that the fallout from Karen's actions was far from over. As the owner of the protected historical landmark, he would undoubtedly be caught up in the legal proceedings, forced to deal with insurance claims, property damage assessments, and who knows what else. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What was he going to do? The thought of being dragged into a drawn-out legal battle filled him with a sense of overwhelming anxiety. But then, a glimmer of an idea began to take shape in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he could use this situation to his advantage. After all, Karen had been a thorn in his side for years, constantly causing him grief and making his life miserable. David straightened up, a newfound determination taking hold. If Karen was going down, then he was damn well going to make sure she went down hard. And this time, the tables were turned. He was in control, and he was going to make her pay. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and legal documents. David found himself thrust into a world he knew little about, navigating the complex web of historical preservation laws and insurance claims. He had enlisted the help of a local preservation society, who were more than happy to assist in holding Karen accountable for her actions. They had quickly mobilized, dispatching a team of experts to assess the damage to the window and begin the arduous process of restoration. This window is a priceless 19th century artifact, the lead preservationist told David, shaking her head in dismay. Repairing the damage will be a delicate and time-consuming process. We're talking thousands of dollars, at least. David's heart sank. Thousands of dollars? He could barely afford the mortgage on his modest home, let alone foot the bill for this historical nightmare. Is there any way the costs could be covered by Karen or the authorities? He asked, the worry evident in his voice. The preservationist nodded grimly. Absolutely. We'll be working closely with the police and the district attorney's office to ensure Ms. Wilkins is held fully responsible, both criminally and financially. David felt a twinge of satisfaction at the thought of Karen being forced to pay for her reckless actions. But the relief was short-lived as the reality of the situation sank in. "So, what does that mean for me in the meantime?" he asked. "Am I on the hook for these costs until this all gets sorted out?" The preservationist offered an apologetic shrug. "I'm afraid so. As the owner of the property, you'll need to front the costs for the repairs, at least initially. But don't worry, we'll make sure you're reimbursed once the legal process plays out." David let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. This was the last thing he needed. He was already living paycheck to paycheck, and now he had to come up with thousands of dollars to fix a window he didn't even break. "Is there any way to expedite this whole process?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't afford to have this dragging on for months." The preservationist offered him a sympathetic look. "I understand your concern, Mr. Alston. Unfortunately, historical preservation cases can be notoriously slow-moving. We'll do our best to streamline things, but you may be looking at a lengthy legal battle." David nodded, resigning himself to the harsh reality of the situation. He knew that Karen was in for the fight of her life, but in the end, it was he who would be bearing the brunt of the burden. As he left the meeting, his mind was racing with a million different thoughts and worries. This was going to be a long and arduous journey, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had bitten off more than he could chew. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for David. Between negotiating with the Preservation Society, dealing with insurance claims, and attending meetings with the district attorney's office, he felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. The financial strain was taking a toll, and David found himself having to dip into his meager savings just to cover the initial restoration costs. He knew that he would eventually be reimbursed, but in the meantime, the burden was weighing heavily on him. To make matters worse, the local media had caught wind of the story, and it wasn't long before David's name was plastered all over the news. Reporters were constantly calling, trying to get a statement or an exclusive interview. "Mr. Alston, can you tell us how this incident has impacted your life?" one reporter asked, shoving a microphone in his face. David grimaced, trying to avoid eye contact. "I'd really rather not comment at this time. This is an ongoing legal matter, and I don't want to jeopardize the process. But our viewers are eager to know more about the woman accused of this crime," the reporter pressed. "What can you tell us about your neighbor, Karen Wilkins?" David's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to discuss Ms. Wilkins or the details of this case. I hope you can understand." As he walked away, he could feel the reporter's eyes boring into the back of his head. He knew that the media circus was only going to get worse before it got better. Meanwhile, Karen was facing her own legal battles. She had been released on bail, but the charges against her were serious. Destruction of a protected historical landmark carried hefty fines and the possibility of jail time. David had been keeping tabs on the case, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation as Karen's legal team desperately tried to mount a defense. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and it was clear that she was in for a long and arduous legal battle. As the weeks passed, David found himself becoming increasingly withdrawn and isolated. The constant stress and scrutiny were taking a toll, and he found himself longing for the quiet, uneventful life he had once taken for granted. But deep down, he knew that there was no going back. The damage had been done, and the consequences were irreversible. All he could do now was brace himself for what was to come, and hope that in the end, justice would be served. As the legal proceedings dragged on, David's frustration and anxiety only continued to escalate. The restoration work on the window was progressing slowly, and the costs were mounting by the day. He had already maxed out his credit cards and dipped into his savings, and he knew that he couldn't keep this up much longer. To make matters worse, Karen seemed to be using every trick in the book to delay and obfuscate the legal process. Her high-priced lawyers were constantly filing motions and appeals, trying to buy her more time and avoid the inevitable. David gritted his teeth as he sat in the courtroom, listening to Karen's lawyers argue their case. They were painting her as a victim, claiming that she had no idea the window was a protected historical landmark and that her actions were simply a moment of temporary insanity. My client has been through a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety due to the ongoing property dispute with Mr. Alston, one of the lawyers said, casting a pitiful glance in Karen's direction. She simply snapped, and in the heat of the moment, made a terrible mistake. David scoffed under his breath, shaking his head in disgust. He couldn't believe the audacity of these people, trying to spin Karen's reckless and criminal behavior as some kind of sympathetic act. When it was his turn to testify, David knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't want to come across as vengeful or vindictive, but he also couldn't let Karen's lawyers get away with their distortions. The truth is, Ms. Wilkins and I have had a long-standing feud over property boundaries and tree trimming, David explained, his voice calm and measured. But at no point did I ever authorize or condone the destruction of her property. And I certainly didn't expect her to retaliate by destroying a protected historical landmark that just happens to be on my property. He paused, locking eyes with the judge. Your Honor, this was a premeditated act of vandalism, pure and simple. Ms. Wilkins knew exactly what she was doing, and she must be held accountable for the consequences of her actions. As David stepped down from the witness stand, he could feel Karen's eyes burning into the back of his head. He knew that his testimony had dealt a significant blow to her defense, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. But the victory was short-lived. As the judge adjourned the court for the day, David couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Karen was clearly desperate, and he had a sinking suspicion that she still had a few tricks up her sleeve. As the trial dragged on, the stakes only continued to rise. The prosecution had presented a strong case, with overwhelming evidence that Karen had willfully and maliciously destroyed the protected historical window. But Karen's lawyers were putting up a fierce fight, pulling out all the stops to try and sway the jury. They argued that Karen had been under extreme duress due to the ongoing property dispute, and that her actions were a momentary lapse in judgment, not a premeditated crime. David watched from the gallery, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe the lengths Karen was willing to go to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. It was infuriating, and he felt a deep sense of injustice. As the closing arguments began, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically, highlighting the immense historical and financial value of the damaged window, as well as the clear intent behind Karen's actions. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, the prosecutor said, his voice firm and authoritative. Ms. Wilkins deliberately and maliciously destroyed a priceless piece of our community's heritage. She must be held accountable for the consequences of her actions. Karen's lawyers countered with a passionate plea for leniency, painting their client as a victim of circumstance who had simply lost control. My client has already suffered tremendously, one of the lawyers argued, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. The financial and emotional toll of this ordeal has been devastating. Sending her to prison would only compound the tragedy. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. How dare they try to portray Karen as the victim here? He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. As the judge instructed the jury to begin their deliberations, David felt a knot of dread forming in the pit of his stomach. He knew that the outcome of this trial could have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire community. If Karen somehow managed to escape the consequences of her actions, it would send a dangerous message that the wealthy and influential could simply buy their way out of trouble, no matter the cost to society. David took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was to come. He had come too far to back down now. Whatever happened, he was determined to see this through to the end, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had. The jury's deliberations felt like an eternity, but finally, the verdict was in. As the courtroom fell silent, the judge read the decision aloud, his expression somber. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Wilkins, guilty on all charges. A collective gasp rippled through the room, and David felt a surge of relief wash over him. Justice had prevailed. Karen's face crumpled in anguish, her eyes brimming with tears. She had fought so hard, pulling out all the stops, but in the end, her desperate attempts to avoid accountability had failed. The judge turned his attention to Karen, his voice stern. "Ms. Wilkins, your actions have had a devastating impact, not just on Mr. Alston, but on the entire community. You have shown a complete disregard for our shared heritage and the rule of law. The court has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison, along with a fine of $500,000 to cover the restoration costs and any additional damages." Karen let out an anguished wail, burying her face in her hands. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of voices as reporters surged forward, jockeying for position to capture the moment. David stood in the back, watching it all unfold with a mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindicated, but another part was simply exhausted. The past few months had taken a tremendous toll, both financially and emotionally. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, David turned and headed for the exit. He knew that the road ahead would still be long and arduous, with the restoration work and legal proceedings still ongoing. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Karen had finally faced the consequences of her actions, and David knew that in the end, justice had prevailed. It was a bittersweet victory, but a victory nonetheless. As he stepped out into the crisp autumn air, David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The nightmare was over, and now it was time to move forward, to rebuild, and to reclaim the peace and tranquility he had once taken for granted.